In this video, we're going to talk about how to tell if two compounds are going to form a homogeneous solution or a heterogeneous mixture. And we have a really simple rule for this. It's called like dissolves like. And what this really means is if the intermolecular forces are the same on two sets of compounds, that they will form a homogeneous mixture, because as you form a mixture, you have to take a pure compound that has intermolecular forces and break those all apart and form new ones with the solute or the solvent. And so if those intermolecular forces are really similar, then that change doesn't have a really large effect on the physical properties of the compound. And so you'll get a homogeneous solution. So what we do to determine if two compounds are going to actually dissolve in one another is we compare their intermolecular forces and see if they're similar. And we can actually reduce that whole process down to looking at if the compound is polar or nonpolar, because the dipole-dipole interactions of a compound will need to exist in a mixture with a different compound for it to dissolve. And so that's where we get this like dissolves like. A polar compound will dissolve other polar compounds, and nonpolar compounds will dissolve other nonpolar compounds, or like dissolves like. So let's look at some examples of that. So let's continue our example of ethanol and water that we looked at before, and I've redrawn it down here. We have our ethanol molecule in black and red, and then water molecules in white. And this is showing how water and ethanol would interact in solution. First showing off hydrogen bonds or hydrogen interactions. So these, remember, exist when you have a oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, hydrogen, or fluorine hydrogen bond, which is right here. We've got this oxygen hydrogen bond. And so the partial negative charge of our water molecules, oxygens, and their lone pairs, will interact with the partial positive charge on this hydrogen that's bonded to an oxygen. The oxygen in the ethanol is also a partial negative charge that can interact with a partial positive charge on a water. And so these hydrogen interactions that would exist within just a pure sample of ethanol also exist between the ethanol and the water. And so there's a similarity there. We also have our dipole-dipole interactions for this. So I've redrawn it here, and we would have a dipole moment overall at the oxygen atom. We have that partial positive charge on the hydrogen and carbon bonded to it, and that partial negative charge on the oxygen. So got more electron density on that oxygen side. And so we can imagine that this then can align with the polarity of the water molecules as well, which are going to also similarly have that partial negative charge at the oxygen. And in this case, a partial positive charge on on the two hydrogens. And so we've got dipole-dipole interactions, and we have hydrogen interactions. And we also have just our London dispersion forces as well for both of these molecules interacting with each other. But really, at the end of the day, the thing that is most important is that both molecules are polar. And so they'll be able to dissolve in one another and form a solution. Let's look at a second example of octane and tetrachloromethane. So here's our octane. This is C8H18. Here's our tetrachloromethane, which is a long one to say. And here is their mixture on the third picture. So in this case, we're going to take two nonpolar compounds and mix them together, and they're going to form a solution. And so our octane is all carbon and hydrogen bonds. And so we'll know that all of those bonds are nonpolar. They have an electronegativity difference less than 0.5. And in our carbon tetrachloride molecule, it looks like this. All of these bonds are polar between the carbon and the chlorine. However, they're symmetrically arranged around that central atom, and there aren't any lone pairs to kind of distort it. So this is going to be a nonpolar molecule. So we have two nonpolar molecules that can then come together. That means that the only intermolecular forces in both of these separate samples are London dispersion forces. And so in our solution, we'll have only London dispersion forces between these two compounds. And we won't have anything with a dipole or an uneven distribution of electrons to try to interact with. And so the intermolecular forces will be really similar for both of these. So both of these compounds are nonpolar. They form a solution. So as we try to decide, will two things form a solution? Will something dissolve in something else? All we really need to focus on is, well, are they both nonpolar or are they both polar? If they're different, they won't mix. They'll form a heterogeneous solution, which is just like oil and vinegar in a vinaigrette. And if you just let it sit, it's going to separate into two layers, oil and water. And it'll be a heterogeneous mixture, not an actual solution. So if we think about the body, if we think about biology, plants, things like that, solubility is really going to be characterized by nonpolar and polar by thinking about what is fat soluble versus what is water soluble as a compound. And so our nonpolar compounds that are really common in our body are fats, which are triglycerides. So here's a big picture of a triglyceride. And you can see there are some polar bonds here. I can see we've got a polar bond between this carbon and oxygen and this one right here. But that little bit of dipole is far outweighed by that long chain of carbon-carbon and carbon-hydrogen bonds, which are all nonpolar. And so we have this very large nonpolar part of the molecule. And so nonpolar compounds will dissolve in these triglyceride fats. They'll be able to form homogeneous solutions. And then polar compounds will dissolve in water. And our bodies are made up of a lot of water. And so we have these kind of two ways that compounds can dissolve or that are stored in our body or made bioavailable within our body. And so in these cases, if we're thinking about it from the perspective of us, remember that fats are going to dissolve nonpolar compounds and our water will dissolve polar compounds to make solutions.